Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to Heartfelt Perspective Sharing, the podcast that's run by trainee clinical psychologists from Taylor's University, Lakeside campus. So, this is our first episode of our new podcast. And today, as April is ASD Awareness Month, we have with us one of our lecturers, Mr. Allistair. So, we'll be talking a bit about ASD awareness, some of the misconceptions, and so on. So, I'll be your main host, Ibthihal. I'm a trainee clinical psychologist from HPS Taylor's. And this is one of my co-hosts, Laavanya.
You've already introduced me, but thank you so much. I'm Laavanya, training clinical psychologist from Taylor's University as well. And we have one more person.
And my name is Lu Xingyan. I'm a trainee clinical psychologist, same as them from HBS as well.
Yeah. And today our not host, our guest is Mr. Allistair. So he's our lecturer and he has a lot of experience working with kids with ASD and children in general. And he said not to call him an expert, but I'm gonna say that he's an expert for us. So
Right.
would you care to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone. My name is Allistair. I am their lecturer. Currently I'm a practicing clinical psychologist and also a lecturer in Taylor's University. So as Ibti has mentioned earlier, I'm not an expert. I don't want to call myself an expert because for me, when we talk about disorders, regardless when we talk about children or adult, right? There's always a lot of things to learn. So I wouldn't call myself an expert, but neurodevelopmental disorders are my area of interest. Yeah.
I think that's a very humble take from you. But okay, you said that this is what you're interested in. Was there something specific that led you to like wanting to work with kids or like neurodevelopmental disorders?
Right. I think if you might take more than half an hour if I were to tell you guys the entire story, but I guess no, I guess if you were to tell my 18 years old or younger me that I'll be interested working with children, I think I'll be like laughing at that point of time because that was not something that I foresee, right? I think a lot of us, especially Asian culture, like we have certain expectation by our parents, right? So I've always been expected to be a medical doctor, right? So what happened was I didn't want to be a medical doctor after so much pressure. So I told myself, let's do something unexpected, but I don't know what, right? So what was interesting, I Googled university to go, and the first thing I saw was International Medical University. So the reason why I applied for it, just because of the term medical, right? So the next thing I saw was psychology. I'm like, I don't even know what psychology is, but let me just go and apply for psychology, right? So I thought um, being a psychologist, I'll be a doctor, which was clearly wrong, right? So fast forward, so what sparked my interest was when I was in IMU, we had an event called the art camp, right? So what happened was there's a lot of children that came to the event. What sparked my interest working with children was that time there was a child that came to me and said he wants to play chess, right? But that time there's no one else that knew how to play chess. I can play chess, but I'm not a professional, right? So I agreed and played with the child. So it was me, the child, and the parent, the dad specifically, right? So what happened was as we were playing, of course the child was not playing well, because I think he was only 10 or 11, and I can see how the interaction between the child and the dad was telling the child like, oh, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that, you should move this and move that, right? But what happened was when the dad left, the way the child played chess was completely different. He beat me to it, and I didn't even, I didn't purposely lose. I'm very kiasu, right? Even if it's a child, I want to win, right? So I lost. So I became interested in terms of how just in working with children. So I was like, oh, this is interesting. When the parents are no longer there, the child behaves differently, right? So that is where I slowly gained interest in working with child. Yeah, of course. After that, when I started doing clinical psychology, I did my part time as well, working in autism related center, and also as I was learning clinical psychology, that is where my interest started to become even more concrete. Yeah, and when I did my internal practicum as well, I dealt with a lot of children. Yeah, I don't know about you guys. What you guys think? You guys, as a trainee, you guys worked with children before?
Not really.
I think we're skipping past the part where you said you just got into it out of spite a little bit.
Right.
It's interesting. I think maybe similar to past you, I'm not really sure if children is a population that I would necessarily want to work in.
Right.
But like you said, the more exposure I get, the more I'm kind of becoming more open to the possibility that maybe it is something that I can pursue at some point.
Right.
I think for me, completely opposite to her. It's not that I do not want to work with kids, but it's more so will I have the patience
Right.
to deal with
Definitely.
them,
Right.
right? Even though I love kids, it's
Mm.
not that I don't love them. I love kids. I love playing with them and so on. But as time progresses, I don't think I'll have the mental capacity or the
Mm.
patience level to deal with them
Mm.
because sometimes they may not understand what we are trying to say
Right.
and they can't really come up to our perspectives. We can become a child, but they can't become an adult.
That's true.
Yeah, so we shall see.
What about you, Lou?
Well, for me, my experience towards children, basically, I don't really have much experience with children, but I'm going to have a child case soon. So I'm kind of excited to meet with children as well because it's sort of my first time actually working with children or at least with individuals with ASD. So I'm kind of excited what kind of things that I can sort of like contribute to
Mm.
his life because everyone knows like people, individuals, when they are in this child stage, it's quite everything you did is kind of, in a way, it will impact them very heavily.
That's
So
true.
in a way, I'm need to like in a way, I'm kind of like have to proceed with very carefully as well.
Mm.
So in a way, I also agree with what Laavanya shared. It may take up a lot of patience and time and a lot of mental effort to working with them as well. So in a way, though I don't have much experience, but I'm excited to work with them.
Correct.
That's nice.
That's a fair point.
Okay, so since you mentioned that you work in other center as a part-time working with kids with ASD, could you kindly share with us what is your perspective or clinical perspective towards what is ASD?
Okay. Wow, that's a very interesting question, right? What is ASD? I think before I answer this question, because all of these are my students, right? So I'm gonna throw the question back, like how I used to throw the questions back in class. So how do you guys define ASD first?
I think if I go first is better.
Okay, go first.
I'll go next.
Okay.
Okay, so I think there's a lot of like social inhibition, inability to like pick up social cues, difficulty regulating emotions, identifying emotions, expressing emotions. So a lot of like the connection between like their cognition and their emotion is a bit skewed in my perspective.
Mhm.
So even though they're able to like experience emotions, they don't really know how to express themselves that well. So that was one aspect.
Right.
That's not exactly one aspect. You literally read a lot where. But other than that, I would mention maybe more towards like they are more towards more non-verbal communication. They go
Right.
with that, and also the very prominent one would be eye contact
Mhm.
when it comes to that. That could be it, since you mentioned most of it.
Lou?
Sorry.
Okay, so from me, my understanding to it is these, like they mentioned, both non-verbal and verbal communication having difficulty on those, and other than the eye contact, maybe they having difficulties in terms of understanding social cues as well. So, like I mentioned, non-verbal communication,
Mhm.
and maybe include some kind of like repetitive behavior
Mm.
and some kind of intense interest onto something that's sort of like not normal, kind of
Like a
intense.
hyperfixation.
Yes, in a way. And yeah, based on that, so another add-on is like they're also kind of not really flexible as well.
Mm.
Yeah, so that's based on my
Big
understanding
figure.
on ASD. What do you think about it?
Now we
Okay.
get
Are
back
our
to you.
answers
Right
satisfying
now, it's
answers?
going back to me. Okay. I think based on the name itself, we have to understand autism spectrum disorder, right? So
Mhm.
it's like a spectrum.
Yes.
Not every child will experience similar symptoms,
Mhm.
nor none of them will have the same intensity or frequency, right? Like all of you mentioned are mostly the sign and symptoms of
Yeah.
ASD. I think the first thing that we have to talk about, if we have to talk about the difficulty in terms of communication,
Mhm.
right? So most of the child that have ASD symptoms, they find it difficult to express themselves, regardless some of them might be verbal or non-verbal, right? So because they can't express themselves, so how can I express myself, right? If I don't know how to tell you guys
Yeah.
what I want. So what I'll do is I will have some externalizing behavior whereby instead of me saying I want this, I might be aggressive. right? Or if I want something, for example, I might just pull you because I don't know what I want, right? But I can show you what I want, right? So that is, sometimes they are non-verbal, right? And in terms of communicating as well, like we already talked about how they find it difficult to communicate. When it comes to communication as well, sometimes they don't have eye contact. When you talk to them as if like they are in their own world, right? A lot of the time when I work with parents, that is one of the sentiment that the parents will always share with me. They say, "Oh, my child look like he or she is in his own world, right? He's ignoring everything around him, right? Instead of interacting with their peers, their siblings, he's just there playing by himself, right? That is another symptoms of ASD. Apart from that, like what Lou has mentioned as well, there's some sort of rigidity in terms of schedule, right? For example, if today if I like to eat, say, pasta, I want to eat pasta every day, right? And sometimes it's not just about I'm fixated to pasta. Perhaps there's some sensory issues that I'm facing as well. Maybe certain food, when I eat it, I don't like it. I just don't like the sensation. So there's it's a multi-layer, I must say, when it comes to the symptoms, right? And like I said earlier, all of the symptoms are that differ from one kid to another, right? So that is one thing that we have to know when it comes to ASD. We emphasize on the word spectrum.
I have a question
Yeah,
follow
yeah.
up with that too. Like you mentioned, right? Since they are very particular about the sensory issue when it comes to food, is it also because they feel safe that they know which ingredient is in the food? Like for instance, let's say it's kimbap, for instance, so they can see the ingredients right there and they're fixated to that because they feel like there's nothing that I don't see, like underlying ingredient in it.
You're talking from like K-drama
Yeah, because I'm very
Right.
like, because even one of my friends, she asked me about this, like, is it because they feel safe that they can visualize the ingredient and there's like nothing underlying there or something that's like hidden, so they feel like, you know what, since I can see these ingredients and I know what it is, so I feel safe to eat it.
I think like at the end of the day, like we talk about just about the what do you call it? The sensitivity again, right?
Yeah.
Is it do I like it, or if I don't like it, I don't eat it. But if I like it, I'm just gonna eat it.
Okay.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So would I say is it because of the ingredient per se? Maybe, maybe not. Right?
Okay.
There's a lot of reason to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But most probably could be sensory related, right? Yeah. That's why they don't want to eat it. Hello?
I feel like for the kimbap thing, at least it's more like, oh, you know what's in it and you already know that you like it. So it's okay. So if nobody can like hide anything in it
Yeah,
that they
yeah,
already
Right.
know that they don't like. Sometimes even I feel like some things I cannot eat because of the texture.
Right.
So like a sensory issue is like depends on the person.
I would want to say something else, but it's okay. Let's move on. Go ahead.
I just want to really add on to the question based on Lava. Would it be more like because of the individuals with ASD, they feel more safe about the certain stimulus from that particular thing? Because I believe one of the symptoms of ASD is that they may have a bit maybe sensitive towards some kind of sounds or any other stimulus. So maybe in terms of rigidity, they are feeling more safe about
Right.
that particular stimulus instead of the food, the ingredients.
Right. Again, I wouldn't say because they feel safe, right? It's just
Okay.
what they're used to or what you know, what they feel like they're comfortable with. I wouldn't say it's safe, but what they're comfortable with,
Comfortable with.
right? For example, I had one of my client last time, right? So he likes to eat soup, only soup. So he doesn't like solid food. If you give him solid food, he wouldn't eat it.
Oh.
Right. So again, that comes to the sensory aspect. Maybe he just don't, sometimes it's not just about the taste, right? Sometimes if you give a child with ASD symptoms, sometimes certain materials that you put on, they might not feel comfortable with, right? They might feel itchy, they might feel not, they just don't feel
Uncomfortable.
uncomfortable, right? So again, it goes back to the sensory aspect in, hypersensitivity or hyposensitivity, right? Even apart from just um, uh, tactile or what you call touch, right? They're also sensitive to light, sensitive to sound. So again, mostly on the sensory, what is comfortable to them. Yeah. Even like right now, as we're sitting here, we can see light, right? And on top of us, we are okay with it. But a child with ASD might not be
Might not.
okay with it. with the intensity of the light. So yeah, it's mostly on the sensory issues. Mm.
Okay, my question to you is that, sir, how do you explain this to the parents, and are there any telltales that the parents should be actually aware of?
Right. I think that's a very interesting question, right?
Mhm.
Of course, there's a lot of signs that you can see at a very young age, right?
Mhm.
So one of the things that we have to understand is what we call the developmental milestones. So what we want to see if there's any delay, for example, in
Mm.
terms of speech delay. Of course, at certain age, you are expected to be able to, a child, sorry, is expected to be able to say certain words, right?
Mm.
Or a certain number of words. For example, by 2 years old, you should be able to say, I want food, right? Even if it's
Okay.
not a perfect sentence,
Mm.
right? Or when it comes to communicating, right?
Mhm.
So another sign that a parents can see is, for example, when you call their name, they don't interact with you,
They
right?
don't
No matter,
respond to it.
yeah, correct. Like no matter
Mm.
how many times you call, for example, hey, T, right?
Mhm.
You should just ignore you,
Ignores
right?
you.
So that is another sign. But of course, we can't say, oh, because she's not responding, she's definitely having ASD. There's a lot
Yeah.
of things that we have to go through. So
Mhm.
what I always encourage parents, if you notice this sign,
Mhm.
perhaps talk to your medical doctor first, because we want to rule out all the medical condition. We want to make sure that your child do not have any hearing impairment or
Mm.
visual impairment. We want to make sure all of it is clear. Then we proceed to, okay, could this be sign of ASD, right?
Okay.
So other than what we have mentioned earlier, for example, communicating or not responding, there's also tantrum,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Throwing tantrums, a lot of meltdown. Of course, meltdown is normal when it comes to children, right? It's something normal, but we have to look at the frequency. How frequent does it happen? How does it happen? And apart from that, then we have to also look into things like is there any kind of rigidity in terms of behavior? All right.
Mm.
One of the thing that's quite common as well, a lot of them, for example, if they play with toys, they will line it up in a straight line, for example, right? So those little things could be a sign of ASD. But like I said, you don't immediately say, oh, ASD. No. We have to go through a lot of assessment, and also to check your make sure there's no medical condition as well.
I see.
Yeah.
Is it also including the part where they are fixated to one doll and they
Mhm.
have like a very emotional breakdown when you separate the doll from them?
Mhm.
That's also part of it, right?
It could be, like I said, but again, we cannot just base it on one
One
symptom,
event,
right? Yeah, one
yes.
event. There must
Yeah.
be multiple symptoms that come with it. Like, for example,
Mhm.
when I was a child, I have what we call bantal busuk, right? As a kid.
Yes.
Sorry. How do
It's
we
like the blankie.
Oh, yeah.
like
It's
if you're a
the
child, you
blankie.
have a
Yes,
pillow or
yes.
toys that you're attached
Yes,
to, right?
yes.
Child support.
Correct, correct,
Yes.
correct, right? So I think when I was a child, I had one too. Every time my mom take it away from me, I would cry. But
Mm.
does he say that I have ASD symptoms? Not necessarily, right? It can be normal. So we have to know when it's normal and when it's not
Normal.
normal. Yeah. So I think
Okay.
that's a question I want to throw you guys. How do you know it's normal and abnormal? What do you guys think?
I think the notion of normal and abnormal is weird because, like, as clin psych students, I feel like there is no normal or abnormal. It's kind of just like based on the circumstances, the situation. So I think the context when we decide if something is like quote unquote normal is very important. So I don't have an answer.
So it depends. So like she mentioned, but very straightforward manner, it's like everything is not black and white. That could be a
Right.
gray zone.
Mhm.
Right.
It just depends on whether it's acceptable
Mm.
or it's not. So it depends on the context of it.
Correct.
Yeah.
So from my perspective, is it normal or not normal? I would sort of base on the judgment of intensity and how much it affects the individual's life.
Right. I agree. I think to a certain extent, this symptom must have some sort of impairment, right? In
Yeah.
terms of social,
Mhm.
in terms of academic communication. Then we know, okay, this is something that is maybe is not so normal, right? But one thing that when I was a trainee, right, one thing that I learned from my supervisor, she said this as well. Sometimes we have to look at the entire bigger picture, because I remember, typical me or typical, when we were young, as we are learning about the disorders, every time I see, oh, a child can speak or a child can't do this, must be a symptoms of something, right? But I remember my supervisor told me you have to look at the bigger context because there was one particular case. Then what we learned or what I've learned from that is actually because the child was never given the opportunity to read. There was no resources, right? No exposure because the parent did not expose the child to ABC, did not encourage the child to read, right? So then the question is that a disorder? No, right? Because it's lack of exposure.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of layers that we have to uncover. Yeah.
That's actually. Do you
No,
say
it's
that?
just that when he mentioned from what we learned disorders, it reminded me of you kept emphasizing the three main things when you taught us in the previous semester, which is the frequency, duration, impairment. It kind of just popped in my head.
Yeah. There's three things.
Yeah.
Oh, not impairment, severity,
Severity.
right?
Get
Yeah,
out.
yeah,
I'm gonna throw shoes.
yeah.
Anyways,
I think like from what you just described also, one of the things like earlier you mentioned autism being like a spectrum, right? Because like ASD is often like undiagnosed in girls more
Right.
often because they
Right.
don't really fit the typical symptoms that
Right.
ASD, like we say that kids with ASD should have.
Mm.
So do you think there's like a reason for it, or like what are more common symptoms in girls or like less diagnosed population?
Right. I think that's a very good question. When we talk about gender differences, right, even if it's not in the context of ASD, right, when we talk about mental disorder in general, right, we can see female tend to have more internalizing condition, right, while us male tend to have more externalizing, right. So putting that into perspective, perhaps maybe a child that have ASD symptoms are not so prominent because she does not have the tantrum. Maybe she does not have all the externalizing behavior.
like the aggression.
Correct, aggression. So there are other way of symptoms can be manifested, right? Like we talk about eye contact and whatnot. So perhaps maybe that could be a potential reason as well why they go undiagnosed, right? And yeah, what do you guys think? What's your perspective?
Also because like just you mentioned, because they tend especially parents, they tend to like relate to the social construct where girls are more timid,
Right.
shy, so it gets like unnoticed by them.
Mhm.
When it's prominent enough, they don't really notice it because they immediately relate to the social construct
Right.
or like the norm behavior that a girl should have, you
Right.
see. And then when males, especially even when they express so much, they still say that if even because the boy is showing like an aggressive behavior, they still say it's because he's a boy.
Mm-mm.
Yeah,
Yep.
they tend to like normalize it in that way.
Mm.
So that's why I feel like it goes unnoticed, even though it's just there.
Mm.
You wanted to say something?
I agree with what I was saying. Basically, it's also you need to consider about the culture perspective.
Yeah.
Wherever the individuals in that specific culture, what does the culture view about the symptoms of that kid?
Exactly.
So, like you mentioned, maybe the boys was maybe doing something impulsive or maybe just tantrum. So the other people from that culture is just saying boys being boys.
Yes.
So they don't see that as a symptom. They don't see that as a warning sign or something like that. So I do agree with that.
Yeah, Mike.
But I think Lava brought up a very important point here, which is normalizing, right? Like boys being rough, right? So sometimes what we can see, or based on my experience, right? Sometimes parent will come and bring their child at the age of 11 or 12, which what we consider as a bit on the prepubescent, but it's a bit more late, what do you call it? Uh, um, Treatment in terms of seeking treatment, right? It's a bit
Yeah.
later, right? So what happened was, for example, I recall some cases whereby, when the child's non-verbal, right? So when I want something, for example, I want water, right? But I don't tell my mom or my dad I want water. I just pull my mom or my dad to the fridge and pour in water. And what parents tend to do is they tend to acknowledge that and that, okay, let me give you water. So that also um, encourage the behavior of if I want something, I don't have to speak for it, right? So sometimes they are able to be verbal, right? But because parent encourage the non-verbal behavior more, so they don't even try to speak. So those are things that we have to look into as well, because a lot of normalizing behavior that parents tend to do. But again, it's not the parents' fault, because at the end of the day, when we talk about ASD, right? There's especially in Malaysia, we need more awareness, right? I think now, as my experience, my 5 years experience, not that long, but I do notice now parents are more aware of the condition or the symptoms, right? At least we talk about it now, right? In comparison to last time, we don't talk about it, or we just say, we're just normalizing it. Yeah.
I think one of the really interesting things you brought up about like the role that parents play, I really do think, especially for ASD and even other neurodevelopmental disorders, the way that the parents approach it really plays a big difference on how the child is raised or grows up to like adjust to the issues that they're facing. So I think that it's really good that you brought that up.
Yeah, definitely.
I have a question. Just now you did mention like if the individual is around like age of 11 or 12, something like that. So you consider that as a sort of like a late stage of receiving intervention already. So what age would you consider as an early stage for them, for the parents to bring in for intervention? So at least that the kids can be received all this intervention early, so that they can sort of like live normal in future.
Mhm. Um, of course, preferably at a very young age, right? Perhaps at what age can at what age are the symptoms have manifested, right? But sometimes, again, it takes a while for parents to understand, what are the symptoms. Yeah, they can see a GP just to help to understand what are the condition that the child having, because we have to understand that sometimes the symptom might not manifest at a very early age because the social demand is not exceeding the capacity or the expectation, right? So let me just give an example. For example, um, if the child is a only child, right? Stay at home, play by he or herself, right? Throughout the entire year, suddenly you when he goes to school, suddenly when he needs to communicate, then you can notice all the symptoms. He's not able to communicate with friends, or he does not able to play with friends or interact with friends, right? Then the symptoms can slowly manifest, right? So again, it depends on the age, right? It depends on the environment itself, but in what way will the symptoms manifest? Yeah.
So, sir, what are the misconceptions that you think parents actually get, especially from the portrayal of social media towards ASD?
Misconception. I think when we talk about misconception, there's always this idea that if you have ASD, you can be very smart, like a super genius, right? What we call savant syndrome, right? But we do have to understand that, again, when we talk about ASD, it's always a spectrum, right? So for me, what I've noticed in the media is either they portray ASD as is two complete or polar opposite. Is either very smart or very aggressive, right? Is that the reality? No, because at the end of the day, it's a spectrum, right? There's a lot of other symptoms that they don't portray, or the challenges that parents or the child itself is struggling that we don't really portray. Yeah, perhaps media wants to share the quote unquote positive side of it, but it's not always the reality. I think that's my thought when it comes to media portrayal of disorders in ASD as well. But what do you guys have any series or any movies that you guys can think of?
I think the one that I thought of, which we were discussing earlier, was also The Good Doctor.
Right.
I think you wanted to say something about it.
I think
Yes.
you had a
Good point
no,
earlier.
it's just that I think some of the portrayal in that is good, where like it does talk about how we tend to undermine people with ASD or like their abilities, but at the same time, sometimes it also implies that oh, you can get away with doing something that's wrong just because you have ASD. So like not taking responsibility for your action. And again, like you mentioned, it kind of just gives like this, oh, he's like a someone, he's like a genius. And I think at one point we need to draw the line where it's like someone doesn't have to be amazing or great for them to be treated as a human being. So like he doesn't have to have the genius ability for him to be treated like a normal person, but they kind of imply that oh because he's so great, he gets all these things, but that's not really needed.
Yeah, yeah. I think I agree with that. And another thing when we talk about these kind of portrayal, it sets certain expectation as well, right? Especially for parents, um, again, we cannot deny that someone have ASD can be successful. There's a lot of people who have certain ASD traits or symptoms. They are very successful, right? But this kind of portrayal might set parent to have certain expectation that, oh, my kids will be okay, my kids will be able to be like this, because I watch it in TV. Some people can be very, easily influenced by media. So that could also set certain expectation and challenges as well towards parents. So because they don't really see the reality of it. Yeah. What do you guys think?
I do agree with what Mr. Lister says. So in a way, what the parents is expecting from a child, in a way, it's not really helping the child. It's actually doing some sort of harm to the children really, because they are setting a high expectation. And if the child doesn't meet that expectation, the parents may do something to force that child to meet that certain expectation, and that may cause some second harm to what the individual is already experiencing.
Yeah, like it's kind of sometimes I feel like similar point, but it's also like because they're like, oh, my child has ASD, and like I saw on the media that's gonna be fine. It also takes away the responsibility of what they need to do to facilitate their child. Even if they're smart, they still need the resources to get to that point. So they kind of take away that responsibility from themselves that like, oh, they're gonna be fine because they're smart or they'll be smart.
All right. Yeah, I agree.
I think also sometimes parents can get too desperate because since they kind of like made a conclusion that their kids are not normal and they see it in an ASD perspective, what they tend to do is that they tend to find like another resort, like a last resort kind of thing where they try to normalize what they're actually capable of. And that's where they set the high expectation part. And they try to push it even though the child can't really afford to do so.
Right.
So I feel like sometimes the expectations can be very burdening,
Mm-hmm.
but it's just that it's more of a desperate kind of situation. If my child can't be normal like any other child, they have to be expert like this. That's when they're bringing the reference of how it's portrayed in the social media. But not all the kids can be like that. And sometimes social media, it can be a lot of like exaggeration, I would say, when it comes to the portrayal wise.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where all the misconceptions comes in as well.
Right. I mean, you have a point there, but when we talk about desperate, for me, perhaps not desperation, but I think some parents try to make sense of what's going on. It's normal, right? Because we do have to understand from parent perspective, it is not going to be easy. It can be very challenging. This is something that we have to be aware of. So they try to, make sense of what's going on. And when we talk about, earlier on, we talk about what's normal and what is not normal, right? When we talk about the norms, the society expect us to behave a certain way. So for parents that have children with ASD, they find it difficult because, for example, if I bring my child out and suddenly throw tantrums, everyone's going to look at me. To a certain extent, that can be difficult for me, right? So how can I then make sense of this situation, right? That's why sometimes, this kind of media can easily influence them, or things will get better. Yep, things can get better, but at the end of the day, we want parents to also know that in order things to get quote unquote better or manageable, they need to seek treatment. Early intervention is always the best, right? But yeah, because of the culture and the stigma that we're facing, that is what preventing them to do so.
Thank you.
Yes, so thank you for sharing. And I do realize that we are focused on the how do we help the child, the individuals with ESD. But how about parents or any caregivers about the individual with ASD? Because they need to experience all these things. Well, let's say by the time they realize that my child having something that is different than the others, so like you mentioned, they need to accept the reality. So it could be hard for them to accept the reality, and it could be hard for them to like take care of the individuals in future because it's something new for them as well. So do you have any suggestion for them?
Right. Definitely, because based on my experience myself, right, I've seen parents that come to the centers, the clinic, or to the hospital, right, bringing the child for assessment. Then when they found out the child, has been diagnosed with ASD, they don't really take it well. It is an overwhelming experience for them. So this is where we, as a clinical psychologist or mental health professions, play a very important role to educate on how we can help with this, the parents to manage the symptoms, right? Because a lot of parents, or I think people in general, think that this is something that we can fix, right? Or we can fix ASD. Or after a while, we go see doctors and a week on. But the reality is, it is a lifelong condition, right? Your child will have it. But the question is, how much can we help the child to, what do you call this? To manage the symptoms, right? For me, I think most parents, what they realize if their child has been diagnosed with ASD, some of the sentiments the common sentiments that I hear from them is that how are they going to survive when we are no longer around, right? So that's why it's important for them to seek early intervention to help the child to be able to manage themselves, right? So after a while, depending on the severity of the ASD, right? So what can we focus on? Do we focus on academic? Do we focus on daily living skills? Do we focus on all those technical skills? So those are the things that we as a clinical psychologist should psychoeducate the parents as well. And of course, there are a lot of support group that can also help parents as well, because a lot of parents are going through this, so there are support groups out there that can help them to talk about it and share opinions on how to manage the symptoms. Yeah.
So what causes autism exactly?
Okay. I think that's a very good question. What caused autism, right? Because there's a lot of myths. So the first thing that we know, autism, ASD, is a neurodevelopmental disorder. So what does that mean, guys, when it says neurodevelopmental disorder?
It's genetic.
Yes.
Nothing causes it. You're born with it.
I think it arises from few different factors. It's just not genetic, right? It can be genetic. It can be, it can be biological, social. It's like an interaction of it, right? Of course, the main primary cause could be genetic predisposition, right? So within a family members, if there's a child who have ASD, there's a tendency again for another child to have ASD, right? So based on my practice, I've seen this quite a few as well, right? Sometimes we have a child with ASD, or the brother or the siblings would have ADHD, or attention deficit attention. I can't even say it. Attention deficit hyperactive disorder, right? Yeah, it's common to see that as well, right? And we can also talk about sometimes when it comes to the age of what do you call it, age of delivery, right? Because research has shown that women who's a bit in the later stage, have higher tendency to have a child with ASD, right? What do we call this? Geriatric pregnancy, yeah. Increases the risk. It doesn't mean that you will have it, right? But increases the risk possibility, yeah. But I think this is a good question, because a lot of the parents or a lot of people perceive that if your child have ASD, it must be the parents' fault, right? It must be because of the parenting. So I think that is something that we have to let everyone know. It's not about your parenting, right? Some parents do develop this guilt. I feel so guilty because I have my children is going through this, right? Or I'm a bad mom, I'm a bad father. But the reality is there's a lot of reason here, right? And genetic also plays a very important role, and that is not something that we can run away from. It's a gene, right? Yeah. So that is one of the common cause of ASD. Yeah.
I do think there's like still a lot of like misconceptions about ASD, like how you basically get it, or like how to deal with it, what people with ASD are like. So like you mentioned, I think awareness is still kind of lacking, at least in the Asian perspective.
Right.
So
Again, there's also a notion that a lot of parents doesn't want a child to have vaccine because they perceive vaccine can cause ASD as well, right? So there's a lot of myth there. So at the end of the day, if you're not sure, please go and talk to a clinical psychologist, talk to a GP, and for parents to have to understand about the condition more.
Also, Mr. Allistair, I think there's quite a famous common myth among the public. There is individuals with ESD, they may have this intellectual disability. How do you view this?
Right. Yeah, I think a lot of people might get confused between intellectual disability and also ASD, right? So in order for you to be diagnosed with intellectual disability, your IQ has to be lower than 70. I'm so proud of my student, right? So lower than 70. So, but when we talk about ASD, when it comes to the IQ, is not necessarily below 70, right? They could be within the normal range as well. So that is definitely how we differentiate between ASD and ID, right? Intellectual disability. So perhaps we can invite another lecturer or student to talk about intellectual disability in the next podcast.
okay,
Right?
we'll think about it.
So, in your opinion, what do you think you could do or we could do to improve the awareness of ASD in Malaysia?
Okay, so what we can do, I think we are doing it right now. I think one of the things that we must do is that we have to have trained professional, right? Trained clinical psychologists to help to to give the awareness, right? So as we all know, clinical psychologists, clinical psychology program now blooming, right? So we hope to develop, train, competent clinical psychologists like three of you. Okay, so that is one thing that we have to do as well. Apart from that, I think accessibility, right? Yes, if we were to compare rural area and non-rural area like the city, we have more resources in the city, right? But when it comes to the rural area, they have less resources, and they maybe have when it comes to the awareness is not as prominent as in the city. So reaching out to rural areas as well to help them to understand more, right? And when we talk about accessibility, I don't know if you guys are aware, going therapy can be very expensive, right?
Yes.
Could be very,
Especially in private sector,
yeah.
right? Yeah, giving resources that can help parents, especially those from the lower SES or lower social demographic status, to help the parents to help with the assessment and screening process and the intervention process to help them to improve their child's condition as well. Yeah, so accessibility, trained professions, all of these are ways that can help to improve the awareness of ASD. Yeah.
Interesting.
I think we are like trying really hard to like help with that now, because in HPS also like we still have offers for April, that's for ASD awareness. So we have like free interventions if you already have an ASD diagnosis, and then also like discounts on like all the assessments for ASD. So we are trying our best too, and I hope that it's like we can reach out to more ASD centers, like you mentioned, in more like lower socioeconomic status areas. So now that we're coming to the end of the session, do you have anything that you want to like say to us? Any final opinions or like any takeaways that you've had like from your experience so far?
I think when it comes to takeaway, when we talk about child dealing with ASD, we always have the tendency to try to fix it, right? Even as a early career clinical psychologist last time, or when I just started, or when I was a trainee, right, I always want to, how can I help to improve the condition, right? What can I do to quote unquote fix, right? Because every time we see something quote unquote broken, we generally try to fix it, right?
Yeah.
But what I've learned throughout my experience is that instead of we trying to force them to fit in our world, why don't we provide a world that can fit all their needs, right? Because at the end of the day, they are still human, right? It's just how they function or how they work is completely different than us, but that's okay. So what we can do to provide them so that they can thrive as well, just like all of us, right? Like I said, at the end of the day, there are a lot of people who have ASD, who has been diagnosed with ASD, are doing successful. Yeah. So that is my takeaway for today.
I think that's a really realistic mindset, because it's not like setting any expectations. It's not saying, oh, it has to be this way. It's just trying our best to give what we can give. So it's mostly just about like the effort we're wanting to put in, able to put in, and the resources we're able to provide so that they can develop adequately. Do you guys have any
No,
thoughts?
I think very similar to what you have mentioned. I think it would also open up people who also feel guilt or shame about having this kind of disorder, to be more open about it. And it's in a way where we try to normalize this, so that, it could help them to feel that they are also normal. Because when we talk about this in a general perspective, I think when we speak it in a public setting, I think they try to be more uh, shy, or more like aware of it, because their fear of being judged, right? So I think it's good that we spread this awareness about it. Anything more?
Well, I like what Mr. Allistair said. So it's like it's not fixing what's broken because it's just who they are. So we don't change who they are. We unlearn the myth, we learn the facts, and we learn to accept them. So accept who they are instead of changing who they are.
Okay, I think that's all for today. Thank you so much, Mr. Allistair,
Thank you
for
for
joining
having me.
us.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, Lou. Thank you, Laavanya. And thank you to our tech boy. Come on, Ben.
See him.
Say hi.
Hi.
Thanks, Ben.
He's taking care of all of our sound checks and everything. So thank you everybody for joining us today. We will be back for another episode soon. So that's
Thank
it
you.
from us.
Thank you for watching.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And subscribe.